So if you open the Book of Revelation today, you're probably bracing yourself for like a high fantasy novel.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? I mean, we're talking multi-headed dragons and bizarre beasts rising from the sea and floating spirits.
Right, a whole invisible cosmic war.
Yeah, exactly. It feels like this chaotic fever dream that requires some kind of mystical decoder ring to even begin to understand it.
Yeah, it does.
But what if the people who wrote those texts weren't actually describing magical creatures at all? What if they were writing a highly technical, deeply logical manual on how political propaganda and information systems actually work?
And that is the fundamental paradigm shift we have to make when approaching this material.
Right.
Because the landscape of these ancient apocalyptic texts, it only feels unmoored from reality if we misread the genre.
Okay.
When you actually dig into the vocabulary and the structure of the sources, you find that the rules of logic absolutely apply here. The writers were meticulously categorizing the flow of truth versus the mechanics of coercion.
So today's deep dive is going to completely deconstruct these ancient texts. We are taking the wild, seemingly disjointed symbols, so the lampstands, the stars, the beasts, the dragons, and we're going to reveal the overarching mechanical patterns beneath them.
Right.
And this isn't just a niche conversation for, ancient history buffs.
No, definitely not.
If you want to understand how human systems operate, how authority is maintained, and how information is weaponized or preserved, these ancient blueprints are stunningly relevant to what we experience today.
They really are. And we can see that blueprint clearly if we start where our sources begin, which is with what they call the architecture of light.
Okay, I like that, the architecture of light.
Yeah, so Revelation doesn't open with a dragon. It opens by very deliberately distinguishing three specific symbols.
Yeah.
And if a reader conflates these three, well, the entire analytical framework just falls apart right away.
Oh, wow. So you have to get this right from page 1.
Exactly. The text identifies 7 lampstands, 7 stars, and 7 burning lamps.
Right. And historically, I think a lot of readers just lump all of those together as general, holy shiny things.
Right, exactly.
Just meant to set a spooky or mystical mood for the rest of the book.
Which is a profound disservice to the text because it explicitly defines each one with distinct mechanical functions.
Okay, so walk me through those functions.
So the 7 lampstands are identified as the 7 churches, or the local gatherings.
Right.
The 7 stars are the 7 angels or messengers belonging to those gatherings. And the 7 burning lamps are the 7 spirits of God. So the crucial functional distinction here, it begins with the lampstand. A lampstand, by its very nature, does not manufacture light.
Oh, right. It's a piece of furniture, basically.
Yes.
It's the hardware that elevates the light so it can be seen in a room.
Right. It merely bears the structure.
Yeah.
So in the same way, the text is establishing that the gathering, the church, does not manufacture the Spirit's light. It simply bears the messenger star through whom that light is displayed.
Oh, it's...
And notice the specific imagery used here. A star inherently shines.
Right.
Therefore, the messenger, symbolized by the star, functions as the actual lamp that is borne by the lampstand. But the Spirit is the actual continuous supply of the light.
Okay, let's unpack this because it almost sounds like a massive broadcast system.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Like the lampstand, the physical gathering of people is the actual radio tower. It's the physical structure rooted in the ground.
Yes, and to take that further, the star, or the messenger, is the transmitter antenna mounted on top of that tower.
Right. And the Spirit is the electrical signal. It's the broadcast itself.
Exactly.
Because the physical tower doesn't create the radio signal out of thin air, right? It just holds the equipment that does. The antenna receives it, and the tower gives it the elevation to reach the surrounding area.
That maps perfectly onto what the text is describing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the Spirit supplies the broadcast. The messenger receives and transmits that broadcast. And the gathering bears the messenger so the broadcast can go out to the city.
That is so clear when you put it that way.
But the architecture gets even more sophisticated when the source material details how this broadcast is actually consumed by the audience.
Okay.
Because John, the writer of Revelation, is commanded to write this entire complex book and send it to these 7 physical lampstands.
So the book physically arrives in a city like Ephesus or Smyrna.
Right.
And presumably because it's a physical scroll, everyone in that gathering can hold the parchment. They can look at the ink and read the words.
Exactly. The completed scroll is fully available to the entire gathering. Everyone can physically possess it. But the text makes a massive distinction regarding comprehension.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because inside that scroll, each messenger is addressed separately. And every single message to those gatherings concludes with a very specific repeating phrase.
Okay, what is it?
It says, "The one who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches."
Meaning, even if you are physically holding the book, you might not actually have an ear.
Right. The profound difference here is between visual literacy and spiritual reception.
That makes sense.
And to use the context of the ancient Mediterranean world, this was largely an oral culture.
Sure.
When John's letter arrived, it was read aloud. The entire lampstand heard the syllables. They could intellectually process the data. But the text argues that merely processing the syllables does not mean you have actually heard the broadcast.
You know, I was looking at the notes on this, and it feels a lot like the difference between staring at the code of a software program and actually executing the program.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You know, you can look at a transcript of a radio broadcast, but you aren't experiencing the live audio. You're just processing raw data. Hearing the spirit behind the words requires something more than just recognizing the letters on the page.
It requires an internal alignment with the signal, not just physical proximity to the radio tower.
Right.
The qualified hearer, the one addressed as having an ear, is capable of discerning the subtext. In the context of the first century, that meant discerning the deep critique of the Roman Empire embedded in the text, not just hearing a cool story about angels.
Yeah, that's a huge difference.
And this brings us to the critical, highly regulated role of the messenger. Because if the messenger is that transmitter antenna, well, their job description is incredibly strict.
Well, yeah, because if the antenna is physically bent or re-engineered by someone who thinks they know better, the broadcast just gets warped into static.
Exactly. The canonical job of the messenger is absolute. They are to hear the Spirit, preserve the testimony faithfully in writing, change nothing, and transmit the light.
Change nothing.
Right. The text goes out of its way to note that the messenger is not commanded to replace the testimony with an interview, an improvised conversation, or their own personal political opinion.
They aren't supposed to editorialize.
Not at all.
Like, if you are the antenna, your job isn't to invent a new morning zoo radio show, right? Your job is just to broadcast the clear signal you are receiving.
Exactly.
Yeah. And our sources point out that this specific architectural rule for messengers, it isn't just isolated to the Book of Revelation, right? We see this across an entire spectrum of ancient literature.
Oh, it is a deeply embedded pattern in ancient Jewish apocalyptic and intertestamental literature.
Like what?
Well, look at the Book of Jubilees, which was a widely read text in the centuries right before Revelation was written.
All right.
Jubilees frames itself entirely as a revelation given by the messenger of the presence, who is explicitly commanded to write down the testimony from the beginning of creation.
So they're just taking dictation, basically.
Right. The authority of the text rests entirely on the messenger, acting as a flawless transmission mechanism.
And the sources also mention the Book of Tobit, right? Which has this motif of 7 angels standing before the presence of God.
Yes. Tobit was incredibly influential. So by the time John writes Revelation, the audience is already familiar with this specific infrastructure.
Oh, they already know the rules.
Exactly. Revelation is drawing on an established, well-understood cultural architecture. It presents 7 spirits before the throne, 7 angels standing before God, 7 stars held by Christ, and 7 lampstands.
Okay, wait, I have to jump in here and push back on the math for a second.
Okay.
Because this is where my brain naturally wants to revert back to the fantasy novel imagery.
Sure.
Revelation 3.1 mentions Christ possessing the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars.
Right.
So if I am an ancient reader or a modern one, and I treat this like a literal inventory list, aren't we talking about 14 separate entities?
Uh-huh.
I mean, 7 glowing spirits plus 7 stars equals 14 different floating beings. And if we throw the 7 lamps into the mix, are we at 21?
And see, that is the exact trap that a hyper-literal imaginative reading sets up.
It's so easy to fall into.
It is, but when we strip away the functional logic of the genre, we end up counting magical creatures instead of analyzing the system.
Okay.
But what's fascinating here is when you look at how these texts operate internally, these are not 14 random, unrelated things.
So what are we actually looking at then?
We are looking at the exact same 7-fold operation, but it's described from different perspectives within the system.
Okay, walk me through how that works in the text.
Let's return to that broadcast infrastructure we built earlier.
The radio tower.
Right. The spirit is the divine presence, the raw source of the light or the signal. The star is the shining messenger office, so the antenna through which that specific signal reaches the lampstand.
Okay.
So when the text says Christ holds the 7 spirits and the 7 stars, It is describing a single integrated communications grid. It's not a roster of 14 individual beings standing in some heavenly boardroom.
Oh, I see. It's like saying a modern company has a fiber optic network and a set of local routers.
Yes, exactly.
You aren't describing two different species of office workers. You're just describing the infrastructure from the macro level down to the local distribution level.
That's the logical conclusion. The source material outlines a very clear unidirectional flowchart for this architecture.
Close flowchart. Okay.
Yeah, so you have one spirit, which manifests as a sevenfold operation, which operates through 7 messenger stars, which are physically born by 7 lampstands in 7 specific cities.
Let me make sure I've got this. So the spirit speaks, the messenger hears and faithfully writes. The church holds the messenger up to display the light.
That is the complete architecture of transmission. It is an operation. It's not a census of angels.
Wow, that is a massive paradigm shift.
It changes everything.
We have taken these mystical glowing symbols and mapped them as functional mechanical components in an information system.
Right.
But this raises a huge question for me.
Right.
If that is how the good guys, the divine side of the equation operate well, this completely changes how we have to view the bad guys.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if the divine symbols are about systems and operations of behavior, well, the adversarial symbols must follow a similar structural logic, right?
They absolutely do. And this is where the source material gets incredibly profound, especially regarding how we understand historical and political conflict.
Okay, alrighty.
So the text argues that the adversarial vocabulary in Scripture, the words that almost everyone assumes are proper names for independent, soul-owning spiritual species, are actually functioning as predicates.
Okay, let's define predicate for our listeners just to make sure we are completely grounded before we move forward.
Sure. So in grammar and logic, a predicate is the part of a sentence or clause that contains a verb and states something about the subject.
Right.
In this specific framework, a predicate is a word that describes a condition, a role, an action or a mode of operation.
Okay.
It describes what something is doing rather than functioning as the birth name of a magical creature.
I can hear people listening to this right now thinking, wait, you're telling me early ancient audiences didn't believe in a literal devil with a pitchfork?
Right.
They just viewed it as a behavioral predicate. Like, how do we know we aren't just projecting modern sociological and linguistic concepts onto ancient writers just to make them sound more sophisticated?
It's a fair question, but we know because of the root vocabulary they deliberately chose to use.
Okay.
The bedrock of this adversarial system in the Hebrew source material is a single word.
Eva.
Eva.
Yeah, I've seen that in the notes, but what is the literal translation of that?
It translates to enmity, specifically the hostile relation placed between two distinct parties.
Enmity.
Yeah, it isn't just a feeling of dislike. It is the structural condition of opposition.
Oh, okay.
Everything else we see in the apocalyptic texts, the monsters, the titles, they're simply different software applications, different predicates running that core source code of enmity.
Okay, let's explore these different software applications because this is where the decoder ring really begins to work for me.
Let's do it.
Let's start with the most famous one, Satan. If it's a predicate, how does the system execute it?
So in this framework, Satan is not a proper noun. It is enmity functioning specifically as opposition or accusation.
Opposition or accusation?
Right, it is the adversarial function in action. When an ancient text says Satan stood against Israel, it is describing the operation of opposition and accusation actively working against that group.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. So you're saying Satan or devil in this context isn't meant to be read as a specific guy with a pitchfork, but rather as a job description. Like a malicious software program running on a computer. The program is opposition, and it's just describing what the system is currently executing.
Yes, that is spot on. And you mentioned the devil. The Greek word there is diabolos.
Right, diabolos.
Diabolos is a more specific flavor of that enmity. It is enmity functioning primarily through slander, false accusation, and the deliberate severing of relationships.
Okay, so if Satan is the general opposition software, Diabolos is the slander and disinformation software.
Exactly.
It's a specific targeted mode of attack.
Now apply that same logic to the concept of the Antichrist.
Oh boy, okay.
Because pop culture usually pictures the Antichrist as a specific nefarious human politician who will appear at the end of time right.
Right, like a singular evil person.
But as a predicate in these texts, Antichrist simply means enmity functioning through opposition to denial of or a substitution for Christ,
So it's a counterfeit operating system. It's substitution software.
which logically requires the next predicate, which is the false prophet.
Oh.
This is adversarial enmity operating through counterfeit testimony.
Let's tie that back to our broadcast analogy.
Yeah, perfect.
So if the true messenger's job, the good antenna, is to faithfully transmit the signal without changing a single word, well, the false prophet is an antenna that intentionally warps the signal or broadcasts a complete fabrication.
Exactly.
And honestly, in the ancient world, warping the signal was a much more dangerous political tool than outright destroying the radio tower.
That is a crucial historical insight.
Right, because if an empire physically destroys a gathering, like if they just burn down the tower, they create martyrs.
Right.
They make their tyranny obvious, which often strengthens the resolve of the resistance.
Yes.
But if they can introduce a false prophet, if they can warp the signal from within, well, they create internal division, confusion, and a populace that willingly subjugates itself because it can no longer discern the truth.
And that eventually leads to the final predicate in the chain, which is the destroyer.
The destroyer.
Yeah, the destroyer is simply the root code of enmity reaching its ultimate logical conclusion.
Wow.
When opposition, slander, substitution, and false testimony run their full course, the end result is always destruction.
So, to summarize this whole chain, none of these terms represent separate spiritual substances. They aren't different species of demons hanging out in a smoky boardroom dividing up the earth.
Yeah.
They overlap because they are all expressions of the exact same adversarial relation, which is Ava.
Exactly.
Opposition, accusation, denial, deception, slander. These are operational verbs that we have mistakenly turned into nouns.
Yeah, when you look at the primary sources without the lens of medieval folklore, it becomes incredibly clear that these terms describe the mechanics of hostility.
But this brings us to a massive practical problem, right?
What's that?
Well, if these predicates are like software programs or job descriptions, well, software needs physical hardware to run on.
Right.
A job description needs an actual employee to execute the tasks.
Yeah.
So who or what is actually running this malicious software? Because if it's not a magical, invisible creature, something in the real world has to be doing the slandering, the opposing, and the destroying.
And this is where the ancient blueprint intersects directly with human history and political science.
Okay.
Because these operations of enmity, they are embodied by physical, accountable hosts. The software runs on human hardware.
Human hardware.
Right. The host can be a single person, it can be a local magistrate, an institution, a kingdom, or an entire imperial state.
Which finally brings us to the really wild cinematic imagery in Revelation.
The fun stuff.
Right, the beasts and the dragons. How do they fit into this hardware and software dynamic?
Well, when the apocalyptic text uses the word beast, it is describing enmity embodied in a very specific structural way.
Okay.
A beast is a predicate for appetite-governed, predatory, coercive human or political power.
So when a first-century citizen living in Asia Minor heard the word beast read aloud from John's scroll, they weren't picturing a mutant bear-leopard hybrid crawling out of the actual Mediterranean Sea.
No, they were picturing the Roman Empire.
The Roman Empire.
Yeah, they experienced this state as a beast in their daily lives.
Wow.
The beast was the Roman imperial cult, demanding they burn incense to the emperor just to have the right to buy and sell in the marketplace.
Right. The economics of it?
The beast was the crushing taxation. It was the military coercion. The text is using a biological metaphor, so a wild, unreasoning predator, to describe a political system that takes what it wants, coerces its citizens, and operates on pure predatory appetite rather than justice.
Okay, so the hardware is the human kingdom. The
Yeah.
software, the predicate is the beast behavior.
Exactly.
That is just brilliant political critique.
It really is.
But what about the dragon? I know the Hebrew word used in earlier texts is tannin.
Yes, tannin.
Yeah.
The dragon or tannin is that exact same predatory operation, but expressed specifically at the highest level of royal or imperial structure.
Okay.
It's the apex predator of coercive political power.
So while a local corrupt magistrate might be acting as a beast, the dragon is the overarching empire itself.
The primary texts validate this reading perfectly.
Where do we see that?
Well, if you look at the book of Ezekiel, the prophet is critiquing the geopolitical superpower of his day, which was Egypt.
Right.
And Ezekiel explicitly calls Pharaoh the king of Egypt, the great tannin, the great dragon lying in the midst of his rivers.
Okay, let's slow down and look at the mechanics of that.
Okay.
Because when Ezekiel calls Pharaoh a dragon, he's obviously not saying Pharaoh is secretly a shape-shifting reptile, right?
Of course not.
And crucially, based on everything we've discussed today, he's also not saying a literal invisible magical dragon owns the nation of Egypt and is like puppeteering Pharaoh from the spiritual shadows.
Exactly.
He's saying the Egyptian state machinery is acting as a devouring imperial monster. The human institution is the host, and the dragon behavior is the predicate. Do I have that right?
You have it exactly right. The text forces us to recognize that Pharaoh is an individual human ruler who is currently embodying the entire Egyptian imperial structure. And this brings us to a fundamental, unbreakable rule of this entire architectural framework.
What's the rule?
The predicate does not own the host.
The predicate does not own the host. Why is that rule so important to the architecture?
Well, think about what a state actually is.
Okay.
A state is an institutional structure. It operates through human rulers, local officials, armies, economies, and laws.
Yeah.
But a state as an entity does not possess an independent, immortal soul.
Right.
The Roman Empire did not have a soul. Therefore, a state cannot own a human soul.
Right, like the Department of Motor Vehicles doesn't have a soul.
Exactly.
The military-industrial complex doesn't have a soul. They are systems composed entirely of human choices.
Yes. And likewise, a predicate, so a behavioral operation like opposition, slander, or predatory coercion, well, it cannot own the person or the system embodying it.
Okay.
The bearer performs the predicate. The host carries the predicate.
Right.
So if a person acts as a false accuser, they're embodying the Satan function in that moment. But the behavior of accusation doesn't magically become a literal demon that takes ownership of their soul. A behavior cannot own the person performing it.
That is incredibly clarifying. It completely demystifies these ancient texts.
It really does.
Like, it removes the whole horror movie aspect where invisible ghosts are fighting for ownership of human bodies and replaces it with a rigorous sociological and political critique of human behavior.
Exactly.
But wait, I have to ask about the most famous adversarial animal in the entire biblical canon,
Ah, yes.
the snake, the serpent in the Garden of Eden.
I was wondering when we'd get to the serpent.
Yeah, does the serpent fit into this predicate chain? Like, is a snake also a metaphor for a government or a software program?
So this is what our source material calls the Nahash anomaly.
Nahash anomaly.
Right, Nahash being the Hebrew word for serpent. And the answer is a definitive no.
No.
The Nahash should not be placed in this predicate chain alongside the beast and the dragon.
Well, wait, why not? If a beast is a kingdom and a dragon is an empire, why isn't the serpent a predicate for a specific type of political behavior?
Because structurally, the serpent is a figure or a sign within the narrative. Whereas the words we just discussed, Satan, devil, beast, they are operational functions.
Oh, okay.
Remember, Eva enmity is the actual hostile relation that is placed between the parties in the garden narrative.
Right.
Satan is the adversarial function that the enmity later performs through accountable human hosts. The serpent itself is a narrative signifier. It's not a behavioral predicate.
Okay, I see the distinction. It's an entirely different category of symbol. But historically, readers just draw an equal sign between the serpent and the devil.
Oh, constantly.
They treat them as interchangeable nouns for the exact same magical creature.
And the source material explicitly warns against doing that. It refers to it as a lazy equation to assume that serpent imagery always and universally equals an evil spiritual entity.
Yeah, it's basically ignoring the context of the passage.
Context is the only way to decode the blueprint. And the text provides a brilliant proof for why this lazy equation fails, and it draws on a very famous moment in the Gospel, John chapter 3, verse 14.
Okay, set the stage for that. What is the context of that verse?
So Jesus is speaking to a religious leader, and he is predicting his own impending crucifixion. But the way he describes it is shocking.
Really?
Yeah, he directly compares his own lifting up on the cross to Moses lifting up the bronze serpent in the wilderness to heal the Israelites.
Oh, wow. He compares himself to this serpent imagery.
Exactly.
Well, if you are an ancient listener who firmly believes a serpent is literally the devil, well, that comparison is culturally scandalous.
It would be deeply blasphemous within the logic of the text.
Right.
If the lazy equation was true, if serpents always literally meant the devil or a fixed predicate of evil behavior, Jesus could not possibly use it to signalize his own redemptive act.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right. The use of the Nahash in John 3 proves that the serpent is a narrative sign. It's a flexible symbol that can be utilized in vastly different ways, unlike words like diabolos, which specifically lock in a behavior of slander.
Yeah, we have to respect the categories the text sets up and not just blur everything together because it, happens to look like a reptile.
Exactly.
So as we look at the totality of our sources, let's kind of synthesize these two massive frameworks we've explored today.
It really is a comprehensive way of viewing the world through these ancient texts.
Yeah, so on the one hand, we have the divine side, the architecture of light.
Right.
The spirit, which is the raw source, speaks. The messenger, acting as the antenna, hears and faithfully writes the testimony without altering a single word. And the local gathering, the lampstand, physically bears that messenger, so the clear broadcast is displayed to the surrounding city.
Beautifully summarized.
Yeah.
And running parallel to that, we had the adversarial side, the
Right.
architecture of opposition. The root condition of enmity, Ava, arises. Then a human host, whether that is a person, a ruler, or an entire institutional system, well, they choose to embody that enmity.
Right.
And finally, the text applies a predicate, words like beast, dragon, Satan, or devil, to describe exactly what that host is doing. So if they're acting as a coercive, devouring state, they are of east. If they're operating through disinformation and slander, they are the devil.
What we've done here is taken a text that for centuries has been treated as a chaotic, impenetrable fantasy world. People open Revelation and see 14 floating spirits, multi-headed dragons, magical creatures, and a cosmic war.
Right.
And we've realized through a close reading of the sources that it is actually a highly sophisticated, deeply grounded system. It is a precise vocabulary for describing how truth is transmitted and conversely how institutional power and human hostility behave.
It completely revolutionizes how we engage with apocalyptic literature.
Yeah.
It stops being a crystal ball and becomes a mirror.
A mirror. I love that. And I want to connect this directly back to anyone listening right now who might be thinking, this is fascinating history, but why does it matter today?
Right. Why do we care?
It matters because this framework entirely changes how we interpret our modern world. When we understand these texts, we stop looking for invisible bogeymen in the shadows. We start trying to decode ancient prophecies to find literal magical dragons.
Yes.
Instead, it redirects our attention toward the real world. It forces us to look at how systems, how corporations, how governments, and how individuals embody these very real predicates of coercion, slander, and opposition today.
It moves the threat from the mystical realm to the practical realm. It demands that we evaluate the institutions around us and ask, is this system operating with predatory appetite? Is this political movement embodying the beast? Is this media ecosystem operating as a false prophet, warping the signal to create division?
It is a lens for analyzing reality, not a fantasy novel to escape from it.
Perfectly said.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today. But before we wrap up, I know you have a final thought that builds on everything we've synthesized today.
I do, and it's a challenging one.
Okay, let's hear it.
If Satan means opposition and devil means slander and false accusation, and if these are behavioral predicates rather than magical creatures operating independently of us, well, it forces us to look much closer to home.
What do you mean?
We spent a lot of time today talking about massive empires, predatory states, and government systems. But in our daily lives, in our arguments on social media, in our interpersonal conflicts at work, or in our tribal politics, how often are we, as ordinary individual human hosts, temporarily embodying these exact predicates without even realizing it?
Oh, wow.
How often are we the ones actively choosing to run the malicious software?
That is a staggering thought to end on. We aren't just analyzing a blueprint of ancient Roman propaganda. We're reading a blueprint that might just be describing our own daily behavior, from a chaotic fantasy to a mirror reflecting our own choices. We will leave you with that to think about. Thanks for jumping to the deep end with us today.